In the video Arguments Part 1, I introduced types of arguments, what arguments are, how to identify parts of arguments, and then deductive reasoning. Here, this is a brief introduction to inductive reasoning. We will look at much more detail in other videos. First, strong inductive arguments are different from deductive arguments. And one of the main distinctions between inductive and deductive reasoning, and maybe I should say the main distinction, is that inductive arguments always involve probability. Now, they need not mention probability, they need not provide data that's set in probabilistic terms, but there's always the possibility that the premises are true, yet the conclusion is false. And that's the case even when we have a strong inductive argument. So, a way of saying this for a strong inductive argument is one such that if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true or likely true. So this is parallel to our definition of a valid deductive argument, where you had that guaranteed connection. With inductive arguments, you do not. You have this likelihood. So for example, here's an argument: the winner of the most popular votes usually wins the election. If we're talking about the presidential election in the United States, that is true. And then you're given the premise Obama won the most popular votes in 2012. You conclude that Obama won the election in 2012. Well, that's an inductive argument. It is a good argument, perfectly fine argument, and in this case, the premises are true and the conclusion is true. Yet we should recognize that there is a potential for erroneous conclusions with this form of reasoning. And to just put up a parallel argument to the previous one, with the same first premise, the winner of the most popular votes usually wins the election. Second premise here, Clinton won the most popular votes in 2016. From those two claims, it would be reasonable to conclude that Clinton won the election in 2016, but that, of course, was not the case. There are various types of inductive arguments. In other videos, we will go through these specific types much more carefully, but just very broadly speaking, we can talk about types of inductive arguments. Arguments that include causal connections are typically inductive, where you have a cause that's inferred from data. So you have this correlation, and then you infer that there's a cause. This is certainly common in research in medicine, in psychology, and of course, many, many other fields. Arguments that are future-directed are typically inductive arguments. So something is predicted about the future due to what's happened in the past. So we do this with astronomy and economics. Yes, even astronomy, where we're really confident about, for example, when the next solar eclipse is going to be, it is still a future-directed argument, and as such falls under the category of an inductive argument. It's possible that some major insane catastrophe occurs that would change that timing. Past directed arguments based on present evidence that gives us reason to think something was in the case of the past, these are inductive arguments. So this is very broad. This isn't talking about the method necessarily. This is talking about categories of what you're talking about. So the fields of archaeology, paleontology, geology, forensic, these are all past directed fields, and they are using inductive reasoning by and large. A specific case directed might be an example of inductive reasoning, where you have evidence that's given from general occurrences, and then you conclude something about a specific case. For example, this is done in law, where you have these broad precedents of previous legal decisions, the stare decisis that is used, and then you draw a conclusion based on what should be the verdict in this particular case. And I want to point out, I hate doing this, but sometimes inductive reasoning is defined as arguing from specific cases to general cases, and then deductive reasoning is erroneously defined as arguing from general to the specific, but obviously here that fails. That's a ridiculous definition. It's mistaken and causes confusion. That's why I hate to mention it. Okay, a couple other types of inductive arguments. There are arguments that make generalizations. This is when you make a general claim that is based on samples. We do this in sociology, psychology. You do this in political polls and many varieties of research studies where you're investigating data and then making a broad claim based on that specific set of data that you have. And then a final one that I'll mention here is arguments, an argument based on a similarity, or arguments by analogy. And this occurs due to some similarities. Other similarities are inferred. This occurs in the field of law, but this can occur in any area. And needless to say, all of the types of arguments that we've just mentioned can be used in philosophy and philosophical reasoning, and they can be applied in many other fields as well as the ones I mentioned here. Fallacious arguments are, you might call, a third type of argument. So we have deductive, inductive, and then fallacious arguments. And this is an argument that commits an error in reasoning such that the premises do not support the conclusion. So we have deductive, where you have that guaranteed connection with valid deductive arguments. You have strong inductive arguments where the premises give you really good reason to believe the conclusion, but there's that chance the conclusion is false. With a fallacy, a fallacious argument, the premises don't give you reason to believe the conclusion. So here's an example. It's set up kind of like a deductive argument would be set up. We have the if-then statement. If Jan goes to the grocery store, Jan will get some wine. And then the second premise, Jan did not go to the grocery store. From that, somebody concludes Jan did not get any wine. Well, this is mistaken. Those premises do not give you reason to draw that conclusion. It's certainly possible that Jan could have gotten wine from a liquor store, a convenience store, a drug store, other places that sell wine besides grocery stores. And so even though the premises are true in those scenarios, if she went to the grocery store, she would have gotten wine there. That could be true. Didn't go to the grocery store, but went to one of those other stores. And then you have a false conclusion. And that's really likely that you get a false conclusion. That's why this is a fallacious argument. Committing a fallacy, we need to keep in mind, that's different from committing a factual error. It's a mistake in reasoning that occurs, right? There might not be any factual errors in a fallacy. And again, just as a reminder, you shouldn't talk about arguments as being true or false. They can be fallacious, they can be valid, they can be strong inductive arguments, but true and false are not terms that apply to arguments. Just a couple examples of fallacies. There are many more, and we're not going to take the time now to explore a wide variety of fallacies, but just here are a couple examples. So an appeal to force. So when there's a threat that is veiled or maybe even overt, and that's made so that there's no rational basis for believing the conclusion is true, but you might have a pragmatic reason for affirming the conclusion is true because of a threat of harm. So if somebody is arguing about what's the best baseball team, and then one of them pulls out a bat and says, believe that the best baseball team is the Chicago Cubs, or I will hit you on the head, well, that might give you a reason to say the Cubs are the best baseball team, but of course, that's not an actual reason to believe it. This is a fallacy of an appeal to force. Just one more, an appeal to pity. And this is when an appeal to sympathy or pity is put forth as a reason for a conclusion. So for example, somebody gets pulled over for speeding and they say this: "Officer, I should not get a ticket for speeding. I've had a very bad day. My dog threw up on the carpet. I lost my phone. I forgot to get the mail check sent, the rent check sent. I'm late for an appointment, with my attorney. We got to cover my DUI case that's pending. Whoops, we said too much." In any case, the appeal is you shouldn't do this, or you should believe that I wasn't speeding because of these completely irrelevant concerns to the issue at hand. And those sometimes may work, but they don't give you a rational basis for accepting the conclusion. Again, there are many other examples of fallacies. Here are just a couple that we've introduced in this first introduction to argument and reasoning and inductive reasoning.